Hi, everybody. Yes, thank you for the warm welcome. It's savvy.io. I think you can also find us at savvy.ai and various domain endings out there. And I'm very excited now to show you how to build this form with Tailwind CSS and Daisy UI. I already am here. I'm right now trying to see if I can see the chat. If you want to shout at me to zoom in even more, but I hope it's good enough as it is now. So I also want to show you quickly, here's my browser. I have my local host up here. I have Daisy UI, Tailwind CSS, and some other pages up front that we will be using now. I also have the exercise here. So, and first thing I want to mention is actually a bit about utility first CSS and the traditional CSS discussion that is out there. So Tailwind CSS is a framework. It is one framework for the concept of utility first CSS. It is neither the only framework nor the first one, but I think probably the most known one with the most marketing and the highest usage out there. The concept is that your classes are utilities, something like padding 1, margin free, etc., instead of like having names like box or card. And the traditional CSS has the advantage that cascading can be simpler in your CSS file. And the traditional CSS with the class names can have the advantage that, for example, here in your DOM will be easier to understand what it actually is. So in the DOM, a class just saying, I mean, the headline is a bit of a weird example, but to say if this class, if this div is a card, you have it easier to understand what it is instead of something like a border and background and etc. And this can also be helpful if you use a monitoring tool, like error monitoring. In these tools, you often see on the containers and HTML elements the user have clicked onto. And then it is easier if you saw they actually clicked like on the card and not like on something margin top 24 pp, etc., etc. So this can get long and then also a bit harder to detect in error monitorings. The advantages of utility-based CSS, and one of the biggest advantages is that your CSS file itself stays rather small because you don't invent new classes. So Tailwind, for example, itself will make sure that only the utility CSS classes you actually need are in the bundle CSS with their chit compiler. Otherwise, back in the days, maybe you still heard of Purge CSS, which is doing a similar job. Darkmode in Tailwind CSS is also supported if you set it up in your Tailwind config. I'm not sure if it's set up here, but if it's set up, you can do something like class dark, and then it will turn to dark if it's set up. I am not sure if Daisy UI supports that. Can't find anything. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's not that important. Maybe it automatically do. Hopefully, maybe some of you knows if dark mode is also supported in Daisy UI. So the advantage of Tailwind CSS is that your CSS file usually keeps being rather small, and it often occurs to be more maintainable for the users. And usually I won't say this, but since I'm seeing this for now more than years online, if you are a person with influence online or followers, or if you're just one person, please stop saying that one of the concepts, traditional CSS or utility first CSS, is bad. They are not. They are both good solutions for the same problem. So let's focus rather on building something with the tools that we have instead of fighting online. And the first thing that we will need to do is to create the layout. So let's start in with the projects.form.view, and we see the headline over here. And here I will say kickstart your own product. So you can see here I have a div and a h1. this is not the project that is built by myself. So I'm not sure actually if this H1 here is fully valuable, fully valid and correct. So I want to show you something that we use at work. At work, we have a template for our merge requests or pull requests. So in this template, I have a list of ticket descriptions, screenshots, mocks, a list of in which browsers it was tested, light mode, dark mode, the screen widths, if the tests run, etc. But we also have a link to the W3C validator, which I'd like to open here. And it leads me to the direct input. Going back, what I always need to do is to copy my skeleton, because for some reasons it is no UX here for me to do this automatically. And what I want to test in my project is now going to the body, and I will do a right click and say edit as HTML, copy everything out. I'm not sure if this example will fully work because there's a lot of development classes here inside, and check. And then I can see that I copied the body twice. Sorry for that. Check again. Now you can see that it is actually green, document checking completed, no errors or warnings are shown. Just something I like to do. Maybe it is also helpful for you. You can also set this up in your CI/CD to validate HTML. All right, moving on to the layout. So on the exercise, we see here that we, if you can see something, have something on the left side and have something on the right side. And I want to use grid CSS to just come up with this layout. So what I will do is to go, let's remove this again, go to my projects form, and I will create my div container below the headline, and it will be a grid that I know. I'm not sure what's coming afterwards, but it will be a grid, and I need 2 containers to that. And I quickly want to see what I'm doing, so I will also give backgrounds to that, maybe the one black, maybe one white. Going back to my browser, I can see that I don't see anything. Sorry for the page reloading. This is in my master memory. I can't turn it off. I know we have hot module replacement. So I see the grid and I see the 2 div containers. Probably they are not there because they are empty. For this case, I have in my terminal a little helper tool where I just say lorem and a number, and it gives me some lorem ipsum text. Going back and pasting it in here, see what we have. Okay, now I actually see something. I don't see the thing that I want to see, but I have something. So now I need to have the grid. So I go on Tailwind CSS and I start to check out the grid. So this is something that we want. What I can see is we have a grid, we have a gap, we have columns, and we have rows. So we only have 2 columns, but they are like 2/3 and 1/3 of the size. And for that, I will use column span. This is something that I'm looking into to say I want to have 2/3 and 1/3. In the code, it will look like grid, then grid calls free. And for the first one, I want to have column span 2. And I want to have a gap of 1 rem. Going back, and now I can see this is somehow the direction that I wanted to go into. If I see this getting smaller, this gets too narrow for me. So what I will change in the code for mobile layouts is to say I leave grid here and also gap and everything else, but the calls are free. I only want to have, for example, medium and upwards. And then, was this correct? No, this was not correct. since I don't have too much time, I will remove this again. Maybe I'm too zoomed in. Is that possible? Yeah, I was too zoomed in. Well, then let's do SM for the sake of the demo, and then it should work and I can zoom in again. Well, perfect. So next we will actually come to the form itself. So I remove this lorem ipsum text again, and inside I will, let me start differently. Let me start with a div container. Maybe you'd like to start like this. And I want to add label and input. I'm sorry, I have Copilot on and I exercised this before, and maybe Copilot already knows what I'm doing here. So it already suggests me to add a label and input. But instead, I go to W Free Schools to check how the documentation is for an input tag. And I can see here the label and input. And let me just copy that, because this is how I would usually work, and have that one here. And I also know that in the end, I want to submit this. So I will need a button and say submit on it. And I will add a click handler and handle this click. If you want to shout at me now, this is good, stay with me. So I will do an alert to say submit. So what we can see here is for the label, it comes with a for, which is important to be the same for the ID, for valid HTML, for accessibility reasons, so we know which label actually belongs to which input. It also comes with a name. I'm not talking about this one right now. It was important, still is somehow important, right now not that important. And I want to be the input of type text. So let's see how it looks like. Well, can't see much because it's still black. So let's remove the black background in here. And I can see the label, the input field. If I click on it, it's not styled yet, and a submit button. All right, that looks a bit unstyled, but what we will do first, let's style it a bit. Let's go to Daisy. And the first thing I want to style is the button. And I can see here on Daisy UI, they are suggesting me the button. There are some button neutral. I will just use the button, BTN in that case. I actually like it more if you just write it out in full, but let's use BTN for a button. And the input will be input. And because I checked beforehand, and I have also the support of Tailwind and my extensions here, I know it is input bordered. Going back to our local machines. So now we see something here. I added a click handler, right? So if I click on submit, it will show me the alert. Inside of this input, I can type something and hit enter, and nothing will happen. So this is why forms are important. I want to have the full native implementation of the browser, even though I'm sending this probably via an API request and not like an browser form, but let's make this correct. Let's start to do a form and put this click handler of the button instead on the form. And here it is not a click, but a submit. Let's try it out. I'm here. I can click on submit. It will work. And then suddenly it reloads the page. If you're younger than me, you might not know why. This is important for the traditional forms. We usually don't want a page reload or page redirect anymore. And this is why we are saying, hey, prevent the default mechanism of the browser, submit with prevent. What I also want to show you is I can set required labels here. I put it on the input field. And if I now go in here and I hit enter, because this is what I can do, it will now tell me, please fill out this field. And it can become very annoying if you're doing development and you just want to submit the form without requiring all the fields. I mean, what you can do is just to remove this every time again and then submit it. That would probably work. But what also would work is to go onto the form and say no validate. And if you do this, don't need to reload, I'm sorry, and just hit, it will actually submit the form. Handy for local development if you don't want to put in all of the data and don't want to add mocking data in here. If I would have done this on the button, like not the submit prevent here, but the button click handler, no validate and required, none of these parts would have worked. For the button, it actually comes with different types, and it often is a type button. And in this case, for the form, it is a type submit. There is not this one default for the browser, so browsers can implement it differently. So I would advise it to always just say if it's like a button type submit or a button type button. It can make sense if you have something like an app button, base button in your components to say you are type button by default, but you can override it to be type submit. All right, there's one thing I also want to show you quickly with Tailwind CSS classes again, and looking also at the argument that a lot of people say it is actually like inline CSS. Right now, I want to show you that it is not inline CSS. If I go here in my DevTools on the H1, and for example, say I want to have the font weight of 700. It is getting very bold. I can here in the headline. I can also say font weight will be 600 and it will be less bold. Or let's make it very so you can see. The rule is whatever comes last will be more important or will have a higher specificity, or in this case, not a higher specificity, but just based on the order, the last one will count. This is different on classes. This has nothing to do with Tailwind. This is just basic CSS. But if I'm going here and I will say font bold and font semi-bold, you can already see my IDE is complaining that I try to apply the CSS property on the same element. And here you can see that it is using font weight semi-bold. So it looks like the same. It looks like semi-bold is more important than bold. But let me turn around the order here. Now afterwards you can see it is still semi-bold, and this is how CSS classes work. What is more important, or what is important, I can't show you right here, but what is important is the order of CSS in the CSS file. What comes first, I think what comes first will be executed, not what comes afterwards. And then you can still override it with inline CSS if you need to. All right, so I talked a long time and I have my one input field, so let's move on. In the exercise, we can see here that we often have the same kind of layout. So we have something like a label, something, and a hint. Label, something, and a hint. So next, let's build this component. I will create the form field.view. And I want to have a script set up, language TypeScript, and I actually want a template. Whoops, sorry. Now, third time is a charm. Going to a Daisy UI to see if they have something for me. So I'm checking for the input, text input. Scroll here, and I found exactly here is what we are kind of needing. So I will check out the HTML and I see something like form control, utility, and normal classes kind of mixed. So let me copy that over here. So here inside is the input field, but we already saw we might need input or text area. So I will do a slot here. And here are some labels. Label top right, and more and more and more. So I think what we will need is here below, I want to have a hint. And here I want to have a label. And here I want to have the whatever label. I'm very bad at naming. If you watched me the last time at the Vue.js watch, you already know I dislike naming things. And now I need my properties for that. So that would be define props. I'm thinking of the right syntax. Thank you, Copilot. And now I have these things here, label text alt, and hint. So text alt and hint look like they are optional already in the design. I would never actually put the label to be optional, but we will look at this in a second. But I don't want to have this span hanging around if I don't actually have input for that. So what I'm doing is to put a if on and to say only in case there is a label text alternative, I want to render the span, and the same for this whole label for the hint. I told you before, there is something like a for and an ID with inputs and labels. So I also want to add an ID here and to go to this label and to say for ID. And we also have a second label, and it is actually valid HTML and completely fine that one control element, one input field is described by multiple labels. So you can definitely do this, one ID for multiple fors. So now let's use this here in our form. So instead of this label, I want to use the form field where I need the ID and the label, and it should not be self-closing. By the way, self-closing doesn't really make sense, but different kind of story. I want to have my default slot here inside. So I have the ID here and here. I have my label, and that looks good to go. So now we are actually here. This is what I wanted. The only thing I don't want is the label. That should be the title of the project. So to move on, I want to use IDs. So I will do the title ID, and I will use a nano ID and restrict it to 6 or 4 or 5. Just not that it's so long. I think I need to import it. Let me check if I'm already importing it somewhere else. So no, yep, with the curly braces. So nano ID from. Let me just copy it. Like here, and then I can set the title ID here, here, and here. Next, I also need a Vue model. So I will use a couple of things. You can do ref, you can do reactive, do whatever you want. In this case, it doesn't matter. So I will actually, because I never do this otherwise, go for the React just for today and say I need a title, default to empty string, and go to the Vue model project.title. So now we are here. And I also just quickly want to print it to see what's going on. And now you can see if I'm typing, it is also auto-updating. If you don't want this effect, if you only want to say you want to kind of persist it whenever you're ready typing, you can use vmodel.lazy. And then only in case if you stop typing and you blur the field, so you click out, then it's actually persistent on the reactive attribute. Can be very helpful for like autosave things if you have that instead of a submit button. Can also be mixed with debouncers and throttles. Just be careful with debouncers and promises. They might work differently as expected. So a debouncer is not actually waiting for a async await. You will need more than that. And what Vue use has, also as a quick tip, is watch debounce, which I also like to use very often, very handy. Back to the topic. So now I have my title field, and I will also need my description field. So I do the same here. Instead of a title ID, I need to have the description ID, call it description. And I need the description also over here. Here we go. And here I now have title and description. The thing that I don't like is I somehow don't have a gap here on the bottom. So what I like to do now is to go onto this whole form and add some classes to it. I actually will now use flex and flex in the direction of the column. And I will use a gap of 4, which I just like to use to create these designs of having a flex that doesn't look like a flex. It doesn't really behave like it because I set it to the column direction, but now you can see here the purple things is being the gap, and I don't have these, but not the last one should not have a margin. But as a side note, there's now also something as an experimental technology called margin trim, which will do the same effect. It trims your margin in the beginning and in the end. Still experimental, so I'm just sticking to my flex solution. All right, next on the list is the input field for the image. Well, let me first, I think I first want to add the project card over here because I think it somehow already existed, right? Like the project card. So I'm going here, I remove my background, and I will say project card. And this is why I'm right now just use this reactive, so I have an easier job now here to put my project card on here. And now I can already see the image that is not existent, my title. Something is not working with the description because it actually is not description, but something like excerpt. I'm jumping over it now, but here is my title. And for the image, there is the app file upload to use. Yep, the app file upload. And it already comes with its own labels and styles, so I don't need my form field. I can easily just say I want to include the app field upload. And I think it needs, oh, thank you, Copilot, a bucket, a label, and a hint. Perfect. I think the project's also correct. And here I actually need, I get a URL back from it. I know because I checked beforehand, and I will use the image over here to do this. But because I don't want to know everybody show you what I have on my file system, what I will do instead, I just copy it from there where I'm looking into there, my notes. I will just use the URL of cats as a service, and now I will see a beautiful cat every time when I refresh the page, because web development should be fun. So I have 1 minute for either selects or these cap. The select is actually pretty simple, so let me do this. Maybe I can do it in half a minute. I plan to maybe overdo it by 5 minutes. Interrupt me if you rather want to ask questions. So the select field, I am using my form field again. I am a bad copy paster, so I always try to clean it up again. I already did a bad job with copy pasting before, because this is not an input, this is a text area, and a text area does not have a type of text, and it probably should look like a text area and text area bordered. And if I check that, you can see it's a text area, but I don't think that it really looks much like a text area. It's just a bit larger than this huge input field. So what I will do, I could set a height. Obviously, I could now say height something. What I want to do instead is to actually give it rows. So I will set the amount of default rows to 10. And then there are 10 rows, and the user then can decide for themselves what they would actually like to have. So now we have the new select field. And instead of an input, we will need a select with an ID of the select ID, and I need the categories here, right? So I will close this again, and I need some options. The first options I always want to give is something like disabled and selected up front, and saying something like please select. You can also give it a value of just null if you need this. And then I want to loop over all of the categories. And we will have here the category and categories. Category ID does not exist. What exists instead, if I hover over it, TypeScript helps me, so category.uuid. And this should be our value. All right, so if I'm back here, I can now see my select field with our categories, and I only need to style it. I'm just guessing select bordered. Yes, perfect. I like if when things are consistent, then we are faster, and I can select it here. It doesn't do much yet because I am needing this category name on the project card. So I will create the category name over here, and I need a computer prop. And I first need to save it. So category ID, UUID, I think, should be null. And then we need the V model on the select field. I'm just, project category UUID. So what I did up here is to make a computed property, and in the categories to find the one with the UUID, which is now the same as the project ID, and then I want to return the name. And if everything is correct, I should be able to select something here, and now you can see here this tiny fashion one. So with the range caps, let me do something else. I will show it to you. So here's my prepared project, and I have it here in my folders, and I try to also push this at some point so you can see where we are going through. And I have the input field with the range here. And I especially wanted to show you this because this is super important for me that you know this. I have the basic setup of properties with a model value, some defaults, and etc. And if I change the V model that is defined on the project form, I have my emits, define emits, to update the model value. And then I also create my value again with the ref of properties, where the newest version of ESLint with the Vue linters will tell you, hey, you're destroying reactivity with that, which is correct. And then you do the watcher on the model value to set the value again. And you also have the watcher on the value itself to emit again. And there's a new way to write this starting with Vue 3.3. It is experimental and it is opt-in, so it won't work out of the box. But you can, instead of all of these watchers and etc., and I hope this will be out of experimental soon, everything what you will need to do is instead to say const model value equals define model, and then vmodel equals model value, and it will work out of the box. No watchers, no emits, no etc. It's not defined here in the props anymore. Here, if you are wanting to do this on Nuxt, you have to go into your Nuxt config TS and override or merge for the Vite config for Vue the script to define the model, and then you have it. All right, these were all of the things. The dates weren't that complicated, but the last thing I want to show you, these are just fancy monies. The last thing I wanted to show you, and then I promise I stop talking, is how I did this effect of having that the soft cap is always smarter than the hard cap, or that the hard cap is at least the soft cap. Multiple ways to do this. All of them are fine if they work. I used actually the watch effect. You could also use two watchers. With the watch effect, I'm saying I want to get the hard cap. I want to make sure that they are numbers. And if the hard cap is smaller than the soft cap, then this part here is important. I'm waiting for the next tick, and then I am setting the hard cap to the soft cap number as well. If the next tick is not there, it would work if you increase the soft cap to a certain point, that it also increases the hard cap. But if you would decrease the hard cap, it would not work out of the box, because the reason, this is a callback function that gets called at the moment I'm changing the hard cap number. And if I want to also set the hard cap at the same time I'm already changing the hard cap, it's just not working. So what I'm doing instead is using Vue on the next tick. to make this work. I'm not sure if this is the best solution. This is my solution. If you know of better solutions, let me know. Maybe my weird workaround, but it works, and I'm happy for that. And with that, I promise I stop talking. And yes, I will be somehow with Daniel find a way to show you the code solution I have fully here.
I love this. I love this. There was a lot of knowledge there. And thank you for going through a bit more as well. Few questions for you of, do you have any go-to resources when it comes to working with Tailwind?
The best, I mean, it is a boring answer, obviously, is to go to Tailwind itself. There is Tailwind UI that you can buy for money, and then you get some components and especially like marketing templates out of box. It is limited, so if you're looking for more and more, you might not get everything you need from it, and you have some kinds of logic and functionality also that they are supporting. But you might need more. So this Daisy UI is already a very good option. The one problem that you can have with adding more and more frameworks to your code base is that you have to maintain more and more frameworks. So if you add Tailwind, if you add Daisy UI, you all have to at some point migrate them a bit. Maybe it's just in the package JSON to update them, hopefully without breaking changes. But for this reason, I would tend to use rather like something like Tailwind UI instead of Daisy, depending on the project, because here you really just copy paste templates into your own files. Then there are some Tailwind components, tailwind.components.com, which I know of, and I rather use it as inspiration. Not often do I copy them, because I also want to be a bit careful with the quality of HTML and CSS I copy paste into my own code base. For Tailwind UI, there was a podcast with Adam Wethan years ago where he mentioned it was harder than expected to build this project because users, so developers in that sense, will really start complaining if it's not accessible, which was really, really good to hear that developers started to complain like, hey, this is not the correct area of things you smashed into this. So what I saw from Tailwind UI, that it's mostly fine and you mostly can just copy it. With the Tailwind CSS components, I would be a bit more careful what's going on here. But these two things would be my go-to things to check. What I would do with Daisy, actually, like maybe if I don't want to import Daisy to my code base and don't want to have this as a dependency, is that I might check their implementations, how they did it, and then copy something different copy something similar, implement something similar to what they have in their code base.
Thank you. And I feel like you kind of answered this one, but to go through this as a specific separate question of, do you prefer to style with Tailwind, or do you normally use a component library as well?
I don't use a component library, but I implement, or we implement our own component library. What I like to do in the code is, everything is here so huge, that I set my Tailwind config to have a prefix. So here's a Tailwind config, and I think you can just say prefix and then TW. So if I'm here, I would now need to prefix everything with Tailwind, but I really like to have this differentiation of where things are coming from. This also has a huge disadvantage because right now I would need to add it to everything. And here I would just hope that you're very good with regex, so you can somehow regex for class and then go for each space or something and a Tailwind up front. For my own components that we are writing, we are prefixing it then with V. And with that, we mean just Vue. I mean, or Vanessa, just kidding, prefix for Vue, and with Vue we mean the style scope block that we can define here, like card, and then I can either, margin something, or you can also use apply something. And there is also a third version that we are doing. So V is a prefix for inline so inside of components, single file components. And the last one would be if there is a main CSS file or any kind of CSS file that I also sometimes have the need to define something in here, which is like not utility, but also like a component with a name. And I would also call this card. But instead of just card, I would kind of prefix it with the project name. So in our case, it is CVY for short for Savvy. And these are our like global styles that we use. So this is the mix that we have on production, and it works pretty well, I hope.
Great, thank you. And what's the best way to create a custom component that works with Vue model?
So define model works great. The Vue use define Vue model. I think there's also something from Vue use that already exists. Apart from that, I want to open that file again that I showed you beforehand, because this is just actually how I would do that. Usually is I try to limit the scope of my component. It can have multiple model values, but then it also gets a bit more crowded in here, what I have to watch to update and what I have to watch to emit again. But this is how I would usually do it to create a Vue model instead. You really have to be careful that inside of this component, I would never add the API call to actually update something or to have the store connection to update the value. What I mean with that, I want to have a component, and if this component receives a property and wants to change the property, I would always do props and emit. I'm not sure how to pronounce it actually. I would never do getting a props and updating the store calling API as well, because then you can really have weird side effects when you, for example, have this watcher on the props model value that you kind of can override your own changes again and end in a loophole and don't know what's going on. Worst case, you have an autosave and it just runs and runs and runs, and you kind of creating a DDoS attack on your own server. So this is why this is very important. Use props and emit. I'm not sure if I fully answered the question. You can reach me on X, Twitter, as Vansel. If you want to ping me there, then you're happy to answer in a DM.
I keep calling it Twitter. I'm like, it's not probably proper, but I keep calling it Twitter. Okay, next question. Do you have any tips about working with fall through attributes?
Oh, yeah, with fall through property attributes as in CSS or in properties. If they are properties, you probably mean that we have another child component in here, and I again would reach down IDs, model values, step, min, and max. I answer that question first, if that is a question. I would do this for 2 levels. If it's more than 2 component levels, I would try to go for a Pinia store. Sometimes this is not possible. That is fine if it's not possible. My second solution would be to use provide inject instead. So at the parent, wherever that is, I provide an attribute, and somewhere where I need to do it, I inject it again, the properties. The only disadvantage is that you don't have yet, I think, the full TypeScript support, because it might be undefined, and then you'd have to kind of use TypeScript as casting to say it actually does exist, so just use it. I am actually not using a third technique, but it's out there, is to, I think, I'm not sure how the syntax of it goes because I never use it, but I think you can somehow export your properties and import them somewhere else again. I've never used it. Maybe it works for you. And the only thing I also can tell you for Vue free is the typed supports, where you can now in Vue free import the type of the properties from somewhere and then define props and do the extra props. But still, then you just pass down properties after properties.
Great, thank you. And do you prefer to use inline classes or to abstract them in more meaningful concept class like dot button?
If it is something we actually also have like in Figma defined and we all know what we are talking of, then I would go to, it depends. I'm very sorry, it depends. I would go for the, I would not call it inline classes, but I would go for the utility classes. What I would do in Vue projects would be to create a Vue component for it and then put all of the styles on it. Example, I'm creating an input.view here, and then I could say input class and all of my whatever things here. If this is getting redundant, so if I have to do these styles a couple of times, and that could be on inputs, on text areas, etc., then I would actually go to the solution where I showed you beforehand, like in the main CSS, and say Savvy control element, and would apply the styles here. And then I can use them in all of the different input fields. I created a new CSS, but I think 4 lines of CSS codes are fine to have this one place where I can override the styles then again.
Great. And I would say last question, but also I have my own question too. But for the last question for now is, can we do the dark mode with Daisy UI?
Well, I don't know. I would happily ask the audience in the chat if you know, then let us know if the dark mode is supported. We all know that the dark mode is very important for our dark developer hearts, and we all want to have it.
Yes, thank you. And last but not least, are you using Arc browser?
Yes, always.
Yay!
The reason for this is the different spaces. So here you can see that I could set up my Vue.js Forge, where I have my tabs here and they are like kind of connected here. But you can see here, maybe you can't see because the screen sharing is so close. I have my private one here, but I also have my work and the space for the working draft for the podcast I'm co-hosting. And for all of them, I have to use different Google accounts. So I have my private Google account, my work Google account, and my working draft Google account. And they are all separated here, and I don't have to log in, log out, log in, log out. Also very good because at Savvy we have user roles such as employees, admins, managers, and specific recipients and assignees. And usually I have 10 personalities if I test our own application. And then I have my 10 spaces set up to test everything like next to each other. Like I'm sharing a feedback here, I'm receiving a feedback in a different account over there. And again, I don't have to log out, log in, and therefore thumbs up for Arc.
I love that it's so different for everybody. I tried Arc and I really wanted to love it, but I'm that person that's still stuck on having multiple screens. I can't do like, the curved screen just in one screen. I'm like, I can't do that. Or Arc. I'm like, I feel like I'm stuck in old school ways for that. But thank you, Vanessa, for coming to hang out today at Vue Forge once again. It was lovely to hang out with you for a bit. And y'all make sure you go follow her on all of the social medias and
all of
them, whichever ones. We'll still call it Twitter for now. So thank you, Vanessa.